Welcome to a virtual tour of the Toms Run Preserve in Monongalia County, West Virginia. This is the second webinar in the Appalachian Cove virtual series. I'm Rick Landenberger, Science and Management Specialist with the West Virginia Land Trust, and much of the imagery that you'll be seeing, both video and photographs, was acquired and put together by Adam Webster. Adam is our Conservation and Communications Coordinator. We'll start our tour with a video that captures the history of the organization. The video is followed by a quick overview on the environmental setting. We'll look at the regional and landscape scale within which the Toms Run Preserve sits. I'll talk a little bit about the geology, the soils, and the hydrology. Once we have a general understanding of the landscape scale setting, we'll get down into the nitty-gritty of the mixed Mesophytic forest and mixed oak stands that exist on the preserve. I'll also talk a little bit about an old field, about 20 acres, that exists in the southern part of the preserve and some of the management challenges associated with that. I'll also note that there has been a high grade on about 150 acres of the preserve, and that has created some unique challenges of its own. So all in all, you'll get a look at the environmental setting. You'll understand a little bit more about the vegetation communities that exist here, and you'll know at least some of the things that we're doing to address the challenges. We'll start things off with the video that captures the history of the organization.
It was a fun time. We were all really young, and really neat things were happening in conservation in those days.
It has been exciting to think back to our early hard scrabble days, scrambling around for any pennies, and now be able to do really large-scale, meaningful land transactions.
In 1994, a group of friends and volunteers got together in Morgantown, West Virginia to talk about land conservation. They realized that land protection had lagged behind other parts of the United States, and they wanted to talk about how they might make a difference. So they established a land protection group known as the Appalachian Conservancy. And as projects began to develop, they realized that here alone in West Virginia, there was plenty of work to be done. So in '97, 3 years later, they renamed the organization the West Virginia Land Trust.
It all started right here at the Elizabeth Woods Tract 25 years ago. You can imagine Steve Hollenhorst and Elizabeth Zimmerman sitting down together over a cup of coffee at Elizabeth's kitchen table and talking about what they could do for conservation in the area. Ultimately, Elizabeth donated her property to the Land Trust, and that was our first parcel. And it has since grown into a 320-acre preserve, which we're calling the Toms Run Preserve, and look forward to having people out here as soon as possible.
I joined the organization, I think, just shortly after or around the time that Mrs. Zimmerman donated her property in Monongalia County. And I think what's significant about it is, first of all, that someone believed in our mission and was willing to take a chance with us. And the second part is that we've been able to deliver on that chance that Mrs. Zimmerman took with us, and I'm very proud of that.
So what we're now calling the Toms Run Nature Preserve, 320 acres, has outstanding natural resources. The recreational aspect goes without saying. We're building trails here, and we'll ultimately have 8 or 10 miles of hiking trails. We've protected the streams on the property, and we're doing some restoration there. We're in the zone of critical concern for the Morgantown water supply. There's a National Science Foundation research project, multi-million-dollar, multi-year, 5-year project that's looking at the effects of drought on the forest. We've got a beautiful cascade on Toms Run that's easily accessible, and there's the Mon River Rail Trail, which is from Morgantown south about 8 miles, and you're here within an hour on a bike and you can go for a hike.
Making conservation real isn't something that just happens. It takes a lot of dedication. And today, even though we seem to have come full circle, we recognize that there are a lot of land trust heroes who contributed to getting us here. We've had great board members, great staff members, donors, granting agencies, legal support, and a variety of other capacities that have brought us to the point where we're able to look at a piece of land and decide how it might really serve a community for the future.
So I love to think about where this organization has gone over the years, and I'm really actually proud to have been part of that whole thing. You know, we went from just this ragtag group of volunteers 25 years ago to today. There's a staff of 8 or 10 people. It's a professional organization. It's accredited with LTA. That's an amazing achievement, and it really means that the organization, I think, can do great things in the future. You need that kind of professionalism. You need that kind of financial support to really make this kind of work happen on a landscape scale.
There is a lot that land protection can do to support our communities, so that we can all place land protection as a key part of West Virginia's sustainable future.
I included this brief environmental setting section of the tour because, as I'm sure most of you can appreciate, the landscape scale context, indeed the regional and national scale context within which a forest exists, is critically important. Forests are not isolated phenomena. They're influenced by the surroundings, and in turn they influence the surroundings. So it's kind of hard, I would argue impossible, to understand the ecology of, for instance, a forest stand without knowing something about the geology and the soils and the hydrology. So we'll take a minute or two to put this beautiful preserve into context. West Virginia has 3 physiographic provinces. From west to east, they are the Appalachian Plateau, the Ridge and Valley, and the Blue Ridge. The Appalachian Plateau has a Allegheny Mountain section, and the Ridge and Valley also has a Great Valley section. The Tom's Run Preserve exists right on the edge of the Appalachian Plateau. Indeed, if you take a landscape scale perspective of Monongalia County, what you'll see is that the county itself has an area of development that runs more or less down the middle, a little bit east of the center, and then to the east of the development, which is basically Morgantown and surrounding communities, one sees the first mountain in the Allegheny Mountain Province. This is Chestnut Ridge, which is about 10 miles east of Morgantown. And the Tom's Run Preserve is just west of Chestnut Ridge and just south of Morgantown. For reference, you'll see Interstate 79, which connects Charleston to Pittsburgh and points north to Erie, and Interstate 68, which runs from Morgantown east to Washington, D.C. via Interstate 70. The state's geology is fairly complex. It's primarily sedimentary rock dating from the Precambrian right up to the Quaternary. What you'll notice here is that the Tom's Run Preserve is right on the boundary between the Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian, both of which are characterized by limestones and siltstones and shales, but have numerous coal seams as well. Most of the sedimentary rock on the Appalachian Plateau is fairly horizontally bedded, but there are numerous small folds and faults, synclines and anticlines. And as you drive around, particularly on the interstates, you'll see lots of coal outcropping on the road cuts. The reason the geology is important is because it, as you probably know, largely determines the soils. Soils are a function of geology, slope, aspect, elevation, climate, and time. And the predominant soil series on the Toms Run Preserve that you see there on the left are the Clarksburg series. These are sandy loams. They range in depth from 10 to about 4 feet, 10 inches to 4 feet or more in places. The slopes are 10 to about 65%, and they have a fairly high cation exchange capacity, meaning they're fairly productive. They're also saturated for 20 or more days during the growing season, and this is a function of the continental humid climate that we have here in West Virginia. Morgantown itself gets about 45 to 50 inches of rain a year, and if one goes east to the mountains, they get another 10 or 12 inches per year. The climate, by the way, in the last 8 or 10 years here in Morgantown has been dramatic. It's been highly variable, warmer than average, more rainfall coming at a higher intensity. But the last 2 summers we've had drought. It's been very hot and dry. So the prediction here from a climate standpoint, from the people who study this at West Virginia University, is that it's going to be warmer overall. It's going to be wetter during the fall, winter, and spring, and drier in the summer. What this bodes for the forest types around the area remains to be seen. Here's a photograph of a Clarksburg series soil adjacent to a logging road that was constructed in 2014, right before we acquired the property. As you'll notice there's quite a bit of erosion. So the root layer is holding all the fine upper horizon soils together, and there's a lot of erosion occurring in the subsoil. This is very common in road cuts around our area. I mentioned soil erosion for a reason. Most of the Toms Run Preserve is unroaded, although the northernmost parcel, what we call the Dunlap-Shuttleworth parcel, was logged in 2014, and the logging roads and skid trails that were developed at that time have, for the most part, been properly addressed. There are water control structures, drainage dips, and water bars in place, and in areas that didn't have adequate drainage, we have corrected the problem. This photograph was taken in 2014 and shows a logging road that's about to cross an ephemeral tributary. You can see here in this close-up is that active erosion is ongoing. So that's muddy water essentially flowing into the ephemeral stream. Again, this was 6 years ago, and this problem has been taken care of. So this leads us to a very brief discussion of the hydrology, not just of Toms Run, although Toms Run obviously is embedded in the landscape, which is embedded in the region, which is embedded in the North American continent, as you can see from the green dot there representing the Toms Run Preserve. We're in the Ohio Basin. We're on the Monongahela River, which is formed by the Tigard Valley River and the West Fork River. They come together in Fairmont, flow north past Morgantown to Pittsburgh, join the Allegheny, and form the Ohio River. Drainage pattern here is dendritic, as it is on the entire Appalachian Plateau. And as we zoom in, you'll see that pattern continue. I always like to point out that hydrology, like many natural features, is essentially a fractal. And you can look at it from the continental scale and you see that dendritic pattern. You zoom into the state scale and you'll see the dendritic pattern. You zoom into a given watershed and you see the dendritic pattern. And if we were to zoom in even further here, which I haven't been able to do for this talk, but if you were to do that, what you'd see is that each one of these little tributaries itself has a dendritic pattern. On to the interesting stuff. Now that you know the environmental setting, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the forest communities that we manage here on the 325-acre Toms Run Preserve. Looking at the statewide forest community mapping, what you see there is the light green in the Toms Run boundary is the dry to intermediate or mesic oak forest. And the dark green is the mixed mesophytic forest. And if you were to see a topo map or a digital elevation model, you would notice that these are the coves. The dark green are the coves, convex slopes, and the oaks are on the ridges essentially. So we'll look first at the old field, then we'll go to the older oak and sugar maple poplar. That's the mixed mesophytic forest. And then we'll look at a very similar forest type, but one that has been high graded back in 2013 and 2014. The old field makes up about 20 acres, so less than 10% of the entire preserve, and it's located in the southernmost area. When I first started hiking around on what is now the Tom's Run Preserve, back then it wasn't that, but this was 20 years ago, I noticed evidence of grazing, and I got a hold of the old aerial photographs dating back to the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and the area was clearly a cattle allotment, a grazing field. And not only are the aerial photos good evidence, but there's evidence on the ground. This is a cattle trough that is still serviceable. It's spring fed, the feeding lines are intact. We were actually going to remove it, and Joey James, the student in the photograph there, he was my first intern back in 2014. And he was poking around out there and he said, hey, it's full of salamanders and frogs and different things. So we decided we'd leave it as a cultural artifact. I was actually glad Joey pointed that out. I tend to get ahead of myself sometimes and want to clean things up and restore things. And well, there's a cultural aspect to land management as well. And you might want to keep some of the cultural features as interpretive or educational resources. I bring students by this very spot quite often and I say, what is that thing? And they say a well, or they don't know what it is. They have no idea that they're standing in what used to be a cattle grazing field. This is a good shot through the kind of sub-canopy mid-story of the old field. And I call it an old field. It's probably in the stem exclusion stage actually of old field succession. It's really no longer an old field, but it has lots of species that are associated with old fields. For instance, the shrub layer, 95% autumn olive. Underneath and around the edges of the autumn olive, multiflora rose. Under and around the multiflora rose, Japanese stiltgrass. The area is infested. One of the things that we've been doing lately is removing all the grapevines, because the grapevines have been keeping the canopy relatively open, pulling down the branches and things. So I've had volunteers in there cutting the grapevines, and it's even within a few years you can notice a difference. This is a nice canopy shot from Adam's drone looking south. And if you're eagle-eyed, like most of you probably are, and you're used to picking out textures in the forest canopy, which I would guess most of you are, you'll see a very distinct ecotone there. And there it is in case some of you missed it. Here we are looking north. This is basically the same area, except for the drone flew across the old field, and where it was looking south before, it's turned around and is looking north. The river valley off in the distance is the Monongahela River, but what you'll really notice is that same distinct ecotone between the two canopy structures. Our next forest community that we'll visit is the mixed oak, what they were calling Drydomesic oak, and mixed mesophytic forests. We could talk a lot about the mixed mesophytic forest. I'm sure most of you have probably read Deciduous Forests of Eastern North America by Lucy Braun. She was the one that coined that term, or at least made it quite well known amongst foresters and forest ecologists. And I'm calling this sugar maple poplar, but like other mixed mesophytic stands, there are 15, 20 species of trees in the canopy here. Here's where we're looking, and even within that circle, we will find both the sugar maple poplar, aka mixed mesophytic forest, in the coves, and we'll see a couple examples of the mesic oak forest, which is red oak, white oak, various hickories, shagbark, and pignut, mockernut hickories. Something that has been, at least to me, recognizing my own personal biases, fairly obvious is that the mature, so-called mature, these are 120-year-old red oaks, are dying at a rate that is higher than one would expect by chance or knowing red oak mortality under so-called normal conditions. What's happening is these trees are snapping off at the root collar. They don't bring up a windthrow mound. They just basically leave a hole in the soil, and it's widespread across the Tom's Run Preserve. Here's an example of the richer, the more mesic sites. This is sugar maple, poplar. You'll find other species like beech. There's red oak in there. There's cherry in there. There's a whole bunch of different. Down low, there's buckeye. And the most distinct thing, besides the differences in the canopy species, is that the understory is very rich here. Whereas in the oak stands, it's quite depauperate. After the spring ephemerals bloom by July, there's really not much going on in the forest understory. Whereas here, there's blue cohosh and black cohosh and all the violets, and there's just probably 20 or 30 different herbs in the understory here all summer long. The coves, of course, collect the water, so this is where you're going to find the streams and springs across the Tom's Run Preserve. They tend to flow down the middle of the coves and not on the ridgelines for obvious reasons. One of the things that has been happening lately out there, now that we've finally gotten some rain in West Virginia, is that the mushrooms are popping. All the fruiting bodies are out and about and dispersing their spores, and we have quite a diverse, rich and diverse population of fungi throughout the forest. Most, however, can be found in the older stands. One of the characteristics of old growth forest are a preponderance of snags, standing dead trees, basically. So I like to think of old growth not as a fixed state of a stand, but as a bunch of characteristics that vary from stand to stand as a function of age and species composition and disturbance history and that sort of thing. So this is not primary forest, and it's not technically old growth yet, but it has a lot of old growth characteristics. One of those is a preponderance of snags, and the sharp-eyed of you will notice something in one of those, in that cavity, that large cavity of the snag there. Some of you may also notice the tree to the left is an ash, and it's a dead tree. The emerald ash borer has come through and killed all our canopy ash trees. There it is if you haven't seen it. Adam takes fantastic photographs. He's incredibly talented. We've got a great archive of thousands of photographs and videos of our properties, thanks to his work. One of the things that I have not mentioned yet is one of our primary management goals, not just in the older stands, but throughout the entire 325-acre preserve, and that is forest recreation. We manage recreation by managing access. So we think a lot about where we put our access points, our parking lots, and our trail system. And this is an example of a loop trail that loops around through what you're looking at there is the mixed Mesophytic forest, sugar maple, poplar, beech. And our trail system at the moment consists of about 3 miles of trail, and it's been built by volunteers. And I'm fortunate enough to be able to work with volunteers on a weekly basis to help build the trails. And this saves us tens of thousands of dollars in contract and construction fees. So I'll end the tour of the mixed Mesophytic and mixed oak forest with a point that I think is probably the biggest threat of several to long-term, quote-unquote, sustainability of that forest type. Japanese barberry is a prolific invasive in the understory of these stands. It's in the seed bank because people grow it in their lawns for hedges, and it regenerates under a closed canopy, and it can just hang out in the understory in deep shade and grow very slowly. And then, of course, the birds and probably some mammals disperse its seeds. And it's everywhere in Monongalia County. It's not only confined to Tom's Run, of course, but you can find it in any forest stand. It's everywhere, and it's easy to pull up in the spring, but it's an ongoing challenge to remove it. Next stop, the high-graded mixed Mesophytic. Here we are in the northern part of the preserve. This is what we call the Dunlop Shuttleworth parcel. It's about 175 acres, and as I mentioned earlier, was logged between 2013 and 2014, about a year before we acquired it. The logging didn't follow a silvicultural prescription. It was a 14-inch diameter limit high grade, which is probably the most common cutting type. I won't call it forest management, but the most common harvest type in West Virginia. When I was studying forestry back in the late 90s, Marianne Faven, who now works for the U.S. Forest Service in their state and private forestry office in Morgantown, published a paper in the SAF Journal of Forestry, where she looked at a random sample of 100 logging jobs across the state and found, I think it was 90% of them were high grades. This is no surprise to you, I'm sure. It's incredibly common, and I would argue that from a sustainability standpoint, quote unquote, and we could talk about that term forever, but from the standpoint of maintaining healthy forests of the type that would normally occur, high grading is probably the most detrimental logging type there is. Here's a photo taken in 2014 looking up one of the coves. I think I took this in the late summer. All the spring ephemerals have faded. There wasn't much summer understory in this stand to begin with. It's primarily an oak stand. You see what looks like a black birch there on the edge. You can see a cherry stump along the creek. And what you see are the remnant trees, the leftover trees. These are trees that were uneconomical, essentially, wouldn't pay their way out of the woods. There's no significant erosion going on. I'm not saying it's the end of the world, but from a future productivity standpoint, a harvest like this is relatively detrimental relative to just about any silvicultural prescription, where the idea is to think about regeneration. Here, the idea is to get the trees out. This is probably a better example. It looks quite nice. If you were to put this photograph on the cover of the newspaper, people would look at it and say, "Oh, wonderful, look at that beautiful forest, everything is green." But you foresters are looking at that and wondering, when can I enter that stand again? What should I do to make sure, that poplar or cherry or red oak or whatever regenerate? And I don't know the answer to that. I think cutting more heavily would regenerate more species, but there's not a lot going on in the understory there. If you look really closely, you'll probably see some sassafras, and you might see some sycamore in there. That's what I've noticed, is that the sycamore is coming up. They tend to dominate in the high grade. no argument that the herb layer benefits. Anytime you open the canopy, and we'll show some canopy shots here in a moment, you're going to get the native and some invasive species coming in. You can see the stilt grass there underneath that wing stem. The summer asters and the fall asters really have taken off in here. They're so thick that it's difficult to even walk through it 3 or 4 years after it's been logged. Nice example of a canopy gap here, and the sharp-eyed of you will see the Ailanthus there on the kind of southern edge of that gap if north is up. Ailanthus is not a huge problem here, probably because the logging wasn't so intensive. It didn't cut every tree. It took maybe 1 in 8 or 10 trees. So you get what appear to be natural canopy gaps. So sugar maple will probably come in. I don't know. Sugar maple and beech and red maple will probably predominate here, along with sycamore in the larger gaps. Yeah, Japanese stilt grass. When I moved to West Virginia in 1989, it wasn't around. People weren't talking about it. You didn't see it. I don't think it was on anybody's radar. I could be wrong about that, but I don't remember it being common until the mid-90s to late 90s. And then it was everywhere all of a sudden. Every logging job had it. The roadsides had it. The forest roads had it. It seems to follow power lines and dirt roads and other disturbances, but boy, is it prolific and tough to deal with. One of my favorite species, something that I looked at for a while in one of my postdoc projects, is Ailanthus, tree of heaven, and it is common throughout the state, and it comes into disturbed areas. It seems to do very well in disturbed, compacted, eroded soils. And a master's student and I did a couple of experiments. This was in the early 2000s, where we basically competed Ailanthus against yellow poplar. And we expected the Ailanthus to beat the poplar, but the poplar completely dominated the Ailanthus except for in disturbed, compacted soils. And that's where you see it. You see it on road cuts, you see it along railroad grades, you see it on skid roads. You see it in neighborhoods, waste places. Fortunately, it's not a prolific invader at Tom's Run. It's there, but we can cut it and just cut it a second time. And it's not forming these big stands. Of course, it's monoecious. There are males and females, and it's a prolific sprouter. And it can form an entire hillside of one genetic individual, not unlike aspen. Many of you probably know that aspen will cover a hillside. Well, Ailanthus does the same thing once it gets going. The idea is not to let it get going that far down the road. So we're on it, and we continue to battle it, and it's a challenge, but it's something that's important to address early on before it gets out of control. That ends our tour of the Tom's Run Nature Preserve in Monongalia County, West Virginia. It's been a great pleasure and an honor to talk with you all. I wish this could have been live. If any of you have any questions or comments or want to pick a bone with anything I've said, by all means, reach out and send me an email. Thanks to the Forest Stewardship Guild and to all you members that take to heart the importance of protecting the forests and maintaining one of the most important environments that we're fortunate to have. Thanks for your work.